large quantities of text or image data for analysis in qualitative research. Um, you can obviously download official documents. You can, get the texts of stuff that's been published and scan it and use character recognition to make it readable as plain text files. There's a whole variety of things you can do. You can get an enormous amount of data. One of the ways for getting data for qualitative research is, of course, by observation in the field. The sort of work that people did to create rich pictures of other cultures. And those are in themselves interesting and complicated, but the other way to do it is through interviewing. Um, and there's some nuts and bolts about interviewing, so we just want to talk through why you interview. You interview because you get extra information. You get information that's not documented. Official documents are very often written to conceal as much as they are to reveal information. They are often quite bare. Official minutes, reports, don't have richness of detail. They don't necessarily fully explain the purposes or the motivations behind the decisions that were taken. And there's different types of interviews. You can have, elite interviews with key political figures. You can have mid-level interviews with administrators and decision makers at various levels. There's the mass observation diaries and interviews, particularly in the UK, which again go over from interview into observation or sort of self-conducted interview. It's very common for organizations when people are being transferred out of a particular post or leaving a job to have end of term or end of tour of duty interviews in order to capture material and gather the lessons which can be learned from the experience. Interviews require planning, and generally speaking, because they're complicated and you're getting a limited amount of time with somebody interesting, you want to do the other research first. You want to know the field. You want to know the information. You need to survey the field and have done the research so you can work out who actually is a worthwhile interview subject. So you tend to interview later in the research process. You should know the topic. If you do not know the topic, then it will be very clear to the interviewee and you will get very little out of them. You need to know the interviewee. Who were they? What was their role? What is their role in the process? What are the right questions to ask them? If there's a particular interview, particularly an elite interview that's important or critical for your research, you need to work in towards that. Sort of begin at the outside and the less important people and build in to the more important. So it requires a careful thought about how you approach particularly critical interviews. There are ethical issues in interviews. In research interviews, you need to, first of all, any research that involves interviewing live subjects or any form of research with human subjects requires ethical approval from a university ethics board. It requires, as part of that process, will require you to declare to the people you're interviewing what the subject of the research is, how the interview will be used, and it requires that you get their consent, both in writing and if you're recording interviews, that you actually record it onto the start of the interview. So that if the consent forms are separated, at least you have verbal consent on the recording of the interview. This is enormously important, and you need to decide and make clear what the purpose of the interview is. Is it just for notes? Will it be quoted? Where will it be quoted? Will you check the quotes back with the interview subject before publication? Will they have an opportunity to correct or amplify the quotes? Will you provide them with a transcript of the interview? And how long will it be kept for? Will the interview be erased? Or will it be kept or stored or deposited in archives? And more often, with research projects, with the general move towards openness in science and research and across every discipline, the research interviews will often be kept and deposited in archives and will be available openly later. And indeed, in the field of oral history or curating archives, collecting stuff for archival work, you need to make clear to your interview subjects that this is an interview which will be available for all posterity. And that will influence how open they're willing to be. You may have to compromise on that. You should repeat that at the end. Get a written signature on a written consent form for that use. Otherwise, you cannot use the interview. And then, of course, there's the question of copyright. The interview subject usually owns what they say. So you must have their consent to use it. So you need that in the consent form. But check, because that law is constantly evolving and developing. So you need to check what the up-to-date stuff is. So in terms of preparation for individual interviews, find the interview subjects. Very often, the more important the interview subject is, the less likely they will be agreeable to being recorded. Or if they are being recorded, the less interesting stuff they will say. Know their personal history. Know their involvement with the topic. Find out how to get to them. Find out if they've been interviewed before, and if they have, read those interviews, because they do not want to answer the same question that they've been asked 15 times before. So focus your time and your energy and your questions on stuff that's useful. Now, mid-level interviews, if you're interviewing 200 campaign workers from a political campaign, you will certainly ask questions that are similar of all of them, and they will be more detailed and more open-ended than just a survey. So understand the difference between those. Find a recent photo or video of important subjects. If you're going to meet them somewhere, know who you're looking for. Nothing's worse than standing in the lobby of a hotel to try and meet a retired politician, looking around going, well, I have a photograph of them from 20 years ago. Do they still look like that now? Not necessarily. How do you get to them? Who do you contact? Can you contact them directly? Do they have a personal assistant? Do they still have an office that screens access to them? Write a formal letter. If it's a formal research project, you have to write a letter explaining who you are, what the project is, why they are important, why they possess information that will add to the richness of the project. How much of their time you expect to need and what you will be doing with the interview needs to be made clear in the initial letter. Nowadays, sometimes it could be an email, but it must be properly and professionally presented, the request. Recording. You need to record research interviews. I mean, some people will not agree to be recorded, and all you can do if they're really important is take handwritten notes. But recording is the goal. And the question is, what technology do you use? How good is it? What quality does it have to be? If it's for an archive, do you want to get broadcast quality audio and video, in which case you need to set up a studio somewhere or borrow a studio and maybe get the interview subjects to come in so that you can get the right quality of recording. If it's just for personal use, we now all carry a device which will record research interviews perfectly adequately if it's only for personal use. If it's a mobile phone, you want to get a mini tripod. I have a couple of them here somewhere that you can sit it up on the desk on the tripod between the two of you so that it'll capture the sound. You need to test the equipment. You need to practice with it. You need to conduct trial interviews with people. Find a willing victim so that you can test the technology, so that you know when it's recording. Is there a little red light that's supposed to be on? Whatever it is. What are the settings? Is the volume going? Do you need external power? Should you want to have it plugged in? You should have spares. You should have a backup for everything. If you're only going to get one shot at an interview, then don't depend on one device to record it. Have two, for the sake of security. If you can use an external microphone, you will get a better audio quality, again, particularly if you're going to want to put this in an archive. Find an appropriate venue. You want someplace that's quiet. You want someplace that's undisturbed, without background noise. I once interviewed the chairman of a local county council for a research project. I interviewed him in his own house, which you would think might be quiet, but of course it was also his constituency office. So the number of times we were interrupted by phone calls and people calling to the door was just amazing. It was very hard to maintain the flow and the continuity of the questioning. For the actual interview, have a checklist. Dress appropriately, which very often will mean professionally, but sometimes it won't, depending on the research subjects that you're interviewing. For a lot of social science research with marginalized groups, wearing a suit to the interview will absolutely not be right. So neat but appropriate. Be clear on the date, the time, the venue. Pre-plan how you're going to get there, particularly if you're meeting someone somewhere that you're not familiar with. Be early. It's better to be early and waiting for them than to arrive flustered 5 minutes late and be trying to set up. Scout the location if you're not sure. I have, for interviewing, for instance, veterans of UN operations, spent quite an amount of time wandering around housing estates in the darkness of December looking for number 53. So scout it and know where you're going. Questions. This is the nub of it. And when I ask people to do an exercise on research interviews, this is what I ask people to do. Write the questions. Okay? Write the questions on the assumption that you're not interviewing a really important person, but that you're interviewing 20 or 30, as I say, campaign workers, administrators, officials, whatever it be. So mid-level people. An interview will usually go for 1 to 2 hours. You will rarely get more than 2 hours. People will run out of steam. That may mean there's only 5 to 10 questions, but those questions may have sub-questions. In fact, every question should have a couple of follow-on sub-questions prepared for amplifying detail and probing more deeply. Have prompts, photos, press cuttings, stuff that will jog the memory of the person you're talking to, may be helpful and useful. Never ask questions that can be answered with a yes or no. Have open-ended questions. Yes/no questions are a survey. Tick the box, boom, done. Interviews, you want questions that will encourage the subject to respond at length. If you're unsure of the point they're making, repeat it back for clarity. And as I said, have the follow-on questions. Silence is okay. It's okay to allow the interview subjects time to think. Unlike in tutorials when the Great Inquisition is somebody speak quickly, right? But in interviews, it is okay to give someone. Remember also as well that the mood. This is an interview where someone is helping you. You are not Jeremy Paxman going, all wolfhound on trying to dissect a politician and embarrass them on camera. You're looking for useful research, so you want to afford them time to think. You have notes and a recording. You need to review those as quickly as possible because you will have impressions and ideas in your mind from the interview that you need to get down on paper. Listen to the recording within 24 hours if it's at all possible, and then use that to write down extra notes, impressions, additional questions that occur to your mind, other points. Review it while it's fresh. An unreviewed interview that you don't look back at, you do 6 months doing interviews and then you have this huge pile of interviews and you start looking back on them, you're going to lose stuff, okay? So space out your interviewing and scheduling it so that you have time to review stuff. Transcription. For a research project, you will be expected to produce transcriptions of the interviews. A full transcript is easy to index, it's easy to search, it's easy to code, but people can speak up to 10,000 words in an hour. That's a lot of words if you have to type them yourself, but it can be done. Or you can pay for transcription, or nowadays you can use speech to text. And in fact, it's increasingly getting to the stage, for example, with a video, you can just, it's not necessarily the best for research planning for confidentiality issues, but there are a number of services that will put transcriptions onto a video or create a transcript of a video for you, and even at the most basic level, you can put a video up on YouTube and it will generate a transcript, which variable quality. Not recommended for research interviews because of confidentiality issues, but doable. In transcriptions, don't edit out the ums and the ahs and the pauses. Put in unclear or inaudible where it is something's wrong with the recording. Don't edit the grammar, don't edit the slang, don't edit the other speech patterns. You can edit those later, but you want your original transcript to be true to what the interview subject said. Do not put words in their mouth, no matter how sure you think you are about what they said. Head all the summaries with metadata, every page, subject, date, where the interview was. Make sure you have got all that information with the transcript, so that you can then backtrack. Also, at what point, run a timeline down the side of the transcript so that you can go back to the actual recording to clarify stuff. So this then is when you've got that and you've got a transcript. This is the old-fashioned hard style coding with a nicely laid out document with space for notes, which you'll do when you review it. Line numbers for the transcription, the text, the question, the answer, some coding. That's what you get out of the interviews. And that will then lead you to this then goes into the whole process of analyzing interviews. But the process of collecting interviews and an awful lot of what we do with research interviews, the thing about it is that research interviews, the process of interviewing, now a lot more of us are creating media across a variety of platforms where we're recording podcasts or panels or seminars or even indeed creating material for teaching online. So an awful lot of the practical things that go into preparing for interview-based research, interview-based qualitative research, in terms of planning and checklists and having your questions organized and kind of having a script and being able to record stuff. A lot of that goes into creation of media across a variety of different ways, and the tools that you'll use may be the same as well. So it is not simply useful in terms of research, but it is also useful in terms of creating media across a range of different, transmedia creation across a range of different subjects for a range of different reasons. But the core of it is being able to script the questions. Write questions that refer back to the themes that you're interested in and the research hypothesis and the research questions you have, and that will link to the coding system that you're going to use. You need to have that worked out before you start going out and interviewing people so that you have a consistent set of questions that will allow you to answer the research problem that you are engaging with. And with that, and this picture of the beach, I will leave you to go and create interview questions.